We are witnessing one of the most critical turning points in the war between Ukraine and Russia. The Kakhovka Dam, an hydroelectric power station on the Dnieper River in southern Ukraine, recently collapsed, causing one of the biggest problems since the beginning of the war. The problem was that the Crimean Peninsula, which Russian leader Vladimir Putin saw as a touchstone, was in danger. Has Russian President Vladimir Putin essentially given up on the peninsula? Some, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, have suggested that this may be the case. Let's take a closer look at the incredible socio-psychological effects of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in Kherson and Crimea, and discover how this destruction will harm the inhabitants of these areas, the course of the war, and humanity. First of all, we should point out that the collapse of the Kakhovka Dam caused one of the biggest problems for the Russians since the beginning of the war. The dam played an important role in the survival of Crimea because an important channel of the Kakhovka Reservoir fed the Crimean Peninsula, which Putin valued the most. The collapse of the Kakhovka Dam in southern Ukraine jeopardized the supply of fresh water to Russian-occupied Crimea. The Kakhovka Dam collapsed after months of maintenance problems and is currently unable to deliver fresh water to the peninsula. Military positions and vital supply routes on both coasts were submerged. Residents of Crimea are preparing for the largest mass exodus since the beginning of the war after the dam collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of people, first in Kherson and later in Crimea, were ordered to evacuate as the floodwaters passed through the downstream areas. Crimea does not have much time left. In addition, many Russian positions and trench lines in Kherson were also flooded after the dam collapsed. Presumably, this will cut off the flow of water to Crimea and other Russian-held areas in southern Ukraine. The dam spanned the Dnieper River, which now forms part of the front line between Ukrainian forces on the West Bank and Russian forces on the east. Severe flooding will likely also damage Russian defense posts and supply routes to Crimea even more. Any possible attack by Russia from the Dnieper and Kherson now seems virtually impossible on the Russian side of the river. There is now a danger for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, whose cooling system is connected to the Kakhovka Reservoir and whose water level is rapidly falling. Kakhovka, the associated Kakhovka Reservoir, and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant are one of the most sensitive areas under Russian control on the river border. Touted as a potential site for Kiev's planned spring-summer counterattack, a meltdown there could create a nuclear disaster that spreads across Ukraine, Russia, and most of Europe. Rafael Grossi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, stated that there is no immediate risk to the safety of the facility, but stressed that the long-term discharge of cooling water from this area that is melting may pose a danger. The emptied reservoir also poses problems for the North Crimean Canal, which stretches to 50 miles to the south and east to supply fresh water to the Russian-occupied peninsula. Most of the water from the North Crimean Canal is used for agriculture or industry, but about a fifth is traditionally used for drinking water, which meets most of the peninsula's needs. Vladimir Leontiev, the head of the occupied Kherson region established by the Kremlin, has already issued a red alert for the canal. In addition, the head of the occupation authority, Sergei Aksionov, announced that although the peninsula's reservoirs currently have a sufficient water volume, the water level of the canal is at risk of falling. When we consider all these official statements, only one reality emerges. That is, the collapse of the dam is at a level that could destroy the agriculture of Crimea. Russian leader Vladimir Putin and his government promised the people of Crimea that they would solve the huge water problem on the peninsula. However, Putin's statements were described as a rhetoric of relief to avoid any unrest in Crimea because, according to the last census in Crimea, where 1,911,818 people live, nearly half of this number have already sold their immovable properties and started preparations for their escape plans. On the other hand, the confidence of the residents of the region living in Crimea, in Moscow, has also dropped considerably after this situation because despite the fact that more than a year has passed since the reopening of the canal, the Kremlin could not secure the canal. This situation was an indication that the Russians did not capture Moral and clashes came to a halt for the Russians. The fact that the Kremlin's military concerns now take precedence over Crimea normally frightens the residents of the peninsula because the only concern of the Russian administration at the moment is to win this war. After the collapse of the Kakhovka Dam, Putin and his officials made it clear that they do not care about their citizens or the inhabitants of Crimea. Currently, according to the most recent data from some local media, many Russian trenches in Kherson have been submerged. But Russian officials claim that the situation in both Kherson and Crimea will not be affected much by this, and that the heavy damage caused by the dam's destruction will be removed as soon as possible. As you may have guessed, there is no problem that can be easily resolved. On the contrary, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people are waiting desperately on the peninsula right now. After a very short period of time, the problems created by the destruction of the dam are expected to have an immediate effect in Crimea. Perhaps when the Russian authorities see that the situation in Crimea is spiraling out of control, they may consider sharing the truth with their citizens. For now, the fine details of this critical situation are being hidden from the inhabitants of the peninsula. On the other hand, after the collapse of the Novokakhovka Dam in the south of Ukraine, observers focused on a very important question in this regard. Who is behind the demolition of the dam? While Ukraine argued that Russia was behind the explosions that damaged the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant and destroyed the dam, Moscow blamed Kiev. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky shared very critical evaluations on this issue in a statement he made online. According to Zelensky, Russia's deliberate destruction of the Kakhovka reservoir, which is particularly critical for providing water to Crimea, shows that Russian forces already understood that they would have to flee Crimea. On the other hand, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov accused Ukraine of an act he described as sabotage and acknowledged that the dam's collapse could affect Crimea's water resources. In addition, Peskov claimed that Ukraine's aim was to deprive Crimea of water and that the North Crimean Canal already received significantly less water. The Russian-appointed governor of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, has already confirmed that the North Crimean Canal risks becoming shallower, while Russia and Ukraine blame each other for the explosions that damaged the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant and destroyed the dam. Let's take a look at what might actually happen on the peninsula in the future. Of course, we said that the destruction of the dam has very significant risks for the inhabitants of Crimea. However, when we look at the situation much more deeply, it's not difficult to predict that a great disaster scenario will occur in Crimea, and that this situation will perhaps even cause the Russians to lose the war. The mass revolt of the inhabitants of the peninsula, which is seen as the key point of the war, or resorting to mass migrations, will leave Russian leader Vladimir Putin completely helpless. In such a case, there is only one task for Kiev, and that is to accelerate the liberation plans for Crimea. Ukrainians have perhaps been very close to liberating Crimea since the beginning of the war. The major offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces have now plunged the Russian army into a deep swamp at Bakhmut in the Donetsk region. The attacks dwindled, and Ukrainian forces broke through the Russian lines at Novokuznetsky in the Donbass region with 30 Leopard 2 tanks. Then the Ukrainians continued to advance towards the Luhansk region, capturing Verkhovka. But the main offensive axis in the current major offensive plans of the Ukrainian armed forces has shifted towards the southern axis of the country rather than the eastern front lines. The Zaporizhia region was the main focus of these striking operations of the Ukrainian forces. The fight against Russian positions south of Zaporizhia involved tanks and armored vehicles supplied from the west and infantry supported by artillery. There were reports of intense fighting outside the town of Tokmak, an important Russian logistics center in the direction of Tavria. Missile units and artillery units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces completed 1354 firing missions in the past day. After this heavy fire, Russian forces lost almost 3 companies of soldiers and 47 units of military equipment. General Oleksandr Tarnavsky, commander of the Tavria Operational and Strategic Unity Group, announced this critical news in a post he shared on Telegram. In addition, as a result of the attacks carried out in the direction of Tavria, the Ukrainian forces destroyed 12 Ifsten tanks, 3 Tu-65 Mr. B howitzers, 3 BM-21 Grad MLRs, and 230 howitzers of the Russian army. The offensive operations of the Ukrainians here were so fierce that the list of Russian casualties was not limited to the ones we counted at the end of the operation. 124 Tyel Motor 1 Su-25 aircraft to air defense system Aileron and Orlan, 10 UAV belonging to the Russian army were all destroyed. Despite all these stunning successes, the Ukrainian authorities insisted that they would not make an official statement when the counteroffensive began and warned against focusing on a single area. Kiev suggested that this set of operations could include several components. But the Institute for the Study of War, a US-based think tank that produces daily updates on the war, reported that after critical news in the Zaporizhzhia-Tavria direction, it concluded that Ukraine's counterattack has indeed begun. Activities across Ukraine were consistent with several indications that Ukrainian counteroffensive operations were underway on the entire front. Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky did not feel the need to explain much on this issue. President Zelensky referred to other areas where clashes were taking place, but suggested he would not elaborate. Although President Zelensky did not want to give details, it was reported that in addition to what happened in Zaporizhzhia, the Ukrainian troops accelerated their efforts to make a deep hole in the Urov-Tokmak region, which blocked the road to the Russian-occupied city of Melitopol. This was an important goal for Kiev. Unconfirmed reports have revealed that at these critical trench lines, the Ukrainian army drove German-made Leopard tanks and Bradley armored vehicles into clashed areas, along with numerous other armored vehicles. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced that Ukrainian forces, consisting of up to 1,500 soldiers from the 47th Mechanized Brigade and 150 armored vehicles, are attempting to break through the front lines in Zaporizhzhia. However, Minister Shoigu claimed that this offensive operation carried out the attack on a Russian army as a preventive blow. Russian mill bloggers, on the other hand, shared explanations from a much more nuanced perspective than Minister Shoigu. Images released by Russian military blogger Rebar showed that the Ukrainian armor remained dormant during the attack, but neither these claims nor Shoigu's claims could be verified. Vladimir Rogov, a Russian occupation official in the region, also told the RIA Novosti news agency that the Ukrainian forces applied maximum force against the Russian positions in the Zaporizhzhia region. In other words, it turned out that the statements made by the Russian defense minister to prevent outrage in his army and among Russian citizens were not consistent with reality. At present, Russia has long anticipated a Ukrainian offensive in this direction and has built multi-layered defenses around this area of the front line, including zigzag trenches, dragon's teeth, and other obstacles. Claims that Kiev is stepping up efforts in the Zaporizhzhia region have also surfaced in NASA's satellite tracking system after days of heavy bombardment. Satellite images showed the state of Russian positions and ammunition depots which burned after the attacks of the Ukrainians. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Hanna Maliar, seeming to confirm that a major attack is on the way, stated that Russia is actively defending the auditive region in the Zaporizhzhia region. Two Ukrainian officials, including a source close to President Zelensky, also seemed to confirm an active phase of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. While the exact details of the clashes remain unclear, Ukraine's efforts appear to be concentrated outside the village of Robotnik. The active Tokmak Highway and active Russian military blogger War Gonzo stressed in Telegram that it is too early to tell the first claims by some that Ukraine's efforts were ineffective. In addition, War Gonzo reported that difficult nights had begun for the Russian forces around Orikhiv and confirmed the success of the Ukrainians in these areas. Other Russian sources spoke of an attack with armored and infantry on Robotnik, where both Ukrainian and Russian aviation were active. Ukrainian troops, on the other hand, struggled to clear the roads in the minefields around Malaya Tokmak. The residential areas of Malaya and Robertson are very close to each other in this area. The Russian and Ukrainian forces have not yet come face to face, so the reports that the Russians carried out an attack on Robatin could not be proven. But the Ukrainians' demining around the Malayan nature had already started a few days ago. Considering all these situations, clashes near Zaporizhzhia will be studied extensively because this part of the front has long been seen as a potential axis for a Ukrainian offensive on Melitopol. On this axis are critical areas such as Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Crimea. Another goal of Ukraine's attack to the south and east from this direction is thought to be to cut the Russian land bridge connecting the long-occupied southern and eastern regions to Crimea. The war between Ukraine and Russia radically changed the tactics of modern warfare. The Ukrainian military has made small war equipment a game changer. Ukraine's innovative war practices stunned the Russian army and fascinated the armies of the world from the beginning of the war. There have been game-changers that have made their mark on certain stages, such as the Javelin, Bayraktar, TB2, Starstreak, M777 howitzer. But if you were asked to explain the Ukrainian war with a weapon, it would definitely be HIMARS. The effectiveness of HIMARS has been proven throughout the war and compared to some weapons in Russia's possession. HIMARS has become a nightmare for the Russian army. At this point, the Ukrainian army has more than 30 HIMARS batteries, and thanks to the successful shots from these batteries, the course of the Ukrainian war has turned in favor of Ukraine. The Ukrainian military uses HIMARS not only for defensive purposes, but also in the vast majority of offensive operations. Since HIMARS is a mobile system, it has become an indispensable weapon for remote attack operations. This is one of the most important reasons for the successful conclusion of every offensive operation of the Ukrainian army. A new one has been added to this nightmare. Recently, it destroyed the most important part of Russia's most advanced anti-aircraft missile system with HIMARS operated by Ukrainian artillery units. Ukrainian artillery units hit the 55 K6 mobile command post, a crucial part of Russia's S-400 long-range surface-to-air missile system. US officials have clarified that the destroyed command post is exactly the type of equipment HIMARS would use to target, although it is difficult to confirm the attack at this stage. The mobile command post, which was reported to have been destroyed in the southern Kherson region of Ukraine, is defined as the brain of the S-400 system. Taking this single vehicle out of combat is the only way to disable the S-400 batteries without destroying them. The S-400 system is of very high value, often well behind the front lines, out of reach of artillery and mechanized brigades. Disabling the S-400 batteries would allow Ukrainian drones and aircraft to fly more freely, improving the tactical position in favor of Ukraine. It has been reported many times that the S-400 was used by Russian forces to intercept rockets fired from HIMARS. Given this information, it can be said that this attack is a duel between two systems. During the attack, S-400 systems may have shot down several incoming HIMARS rockets, but when they kidnapped one, it was enough to decide the fate of the systems. So how reliable is the effectiveness of the S-400s? Russia has developed the S-400 system to replace the obsolete S-300, although both are still in use. The S-400 Triumph, also known by its NATO reporting name SA-21 Growler, is a mobile platform that U.S. defense officials describe as roughly comparable to the U.S. Patriot missile system. The characterization of this attack as a duel is directly comparable to its duel with Russian Kinzhal missiles launched against Patriot batteries supplied by the United States to Ukraine. In this context, it can be said that the S-400 batteries are not as successful as the Patriots. Western analysts noted that since the beginning of the Ukraine war, only 2 S-400 mobile surface-to-air missile systems have been destroyed. However, this number only includes visually confirmed losses, so the number could be higher. Looking at the current casualty list of the Ukrainian General Staff, the Ukrainian army has destroyed close to 350 Russian air defense systems since the beginning of the war. However, even if it is not disclosed how many of them are S-400 systems, it can be understood what kind of systems were destroyed from the regions where the Russian air defense systems were destroyed. This brings us to the attacks on Russian elements in Crimea. The Ukrainian army destroyed at least 150 of the 350 air defense systems it destroyed over the Crimea. Considering that Russia keeps Crimea security at a high level and S-400 systems are mostly deployed in Crimea, Ukraine may have destroyed at least 50 Siemens 400 batteries during the war. With the withdrawal of the Russian army from Kherson, the deployment of HIMARS to Kherson greatly strengthened Ukraine's southern defenses. The United States closely monitors the HIMARS capabilities of the Ukrainian artillery and continues to make moves towards it in new military aid packages. The United States supplied Ukraine with ammunition for artillery systems, as well as 38 HIMARS batteries. Washington also sent another Patriot air defense battery to the Ukrainian armed forces. This move by the U.S. is a huge step forward in supporting the Ukraine counteroffensive which is about to begin. Since the Ukrainian army will be busy with defense while attacking, this will increase the need for modern defense weapons, and this assistance of the USA has been described as a move that supports the Ukrainian counterattack on a large scale. The Russian army lacked modern weapons throughout the war. Although Russia has modern main battle tanks such as the 90, it used only a small amount during the Ukraine war due to the small amounts of these tanks. This situation put the Russian army in a very weak position against the Ukrainian army equipped with modern weapons. Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke about what many believe was the beginning of Ukraine's much-anticipated counteroffensive and admitted that his forces currently do not have enough modern weapons. Kremlin officials reported that Ukraine launched an offensive against Russia, but Ukrainian officials stated that offensive operations against the Russian army did not signal the start of the expected counterattack. Officials reported that Putin acknowledged that Moscow troops were facing a shortage of modern weapons and hoped that the country's military industry could soon be able to meet the growing demand. While world leaders have been warning for months that President Putin's modern missiles may soon run out, reports from the Russian military have suggested that Russian troops resorted to pulling old tanks from storage due to heavy losses in armored vehicles in Ukraine. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces said it was against Putin's character to accept this after Russia said it believed certain types of weapons were declining. The Russian army is particularly deficient in main battle tanks and ballistic missiles. This is evidenced by the fact that they use a lot of glider bombs today. The Russian army still has cruise missiles, but of course, they are very expensive, and Russia does not have the power to replace them. That's why Russia uses cruise missiles very little in the Ukraine war. Despite President Putin's wishes, weapons production facilities came to a standstill due to the economic crisis due to global economic sanctions. This is also due to the fact that the parts used in the manufacture of weapons are imported from abroad. Although Russian President Vladimir Putin does not accept it, his army is being defeated in Ukraine. The post-Soviet image of a strong Russia was crushed many times during the Ukraine war. As President Putin admits, it is delusional to put his army into battle without modern weapons and expect success from it.